In this opportunity, we are going to talk about the relationship between horizon and terminal value. We will explore the relationship between the length of the cash flow projection, that we understand as horizon, and the terminal value, when the terminal value is represented by a perpetuity, which is the common case. To understand this relationship, we must understand first three important topics. One is the relationship between reinvestment and growth. Second is the long-term sustainability of high returns and growth. And third is the number of periods of a detailed cash flow projection makes sense. Let's start with reinvestment and growth. In a previous presentation, terminal value, growth, and reinvestment, the relationship between reinvestment and growth was explained. It was stated that G, growth, is equal to B multiplied by ROIC, where B is the plowback ratio, meaning the proportion of the available funds that is reinvested in the firm. And ROIC is return on invested capital, which is the return on the investment of these funds. However, this explanation ignored the impact of inflation. Let's incorporate inflation. Let's define the inflation rate as P. R will be the nominal discount rate. G is the nominal growth rate. ROIC, as we already know, is the nominal return on reinvested earnings. And B is the plowback ratio. It can be shown that the growth rate, the nominal growth rate, now is given by this formula, in which we have two components. The first component is B multiplied by ROIC, which is exactly the same that we had before. It's the plowback ratio multiplied by the return on invested earnings. But now we have a second component, second part, which is 1 minus B multiplied by pi. And this is the part of growth that comes from inflation. Actually, it's not real growth. The terminal value is now given by this formula. Terminal value at time n is equal to the free cash flow at time n plus 1 divided by R minus G. And we know that when we are valuing a firm, R, the nominal discount rate, is equal to WACC. So we can write this formula substituting R by WACC. Now let's analyze the case in which no value is added. We know that all firms are supposed to add value all the time. Firms exist with the purpose of adding value, of identifying projects with a positive net present value, meaning that the return on the money that is invested is larger than the discount rate. Well, let's look at the case in which ROIC is equal to WACC, meaning that the net present value of the investments made by the firm is 0. We go back to our formula for terminal value at time n. First, the numerator, we have free cash flow at time n plus 1. And then the denominator is WACC minus G. Okay, let's focus on the numerator first. Free cash flow at time n plus 1 will be equal to 1 minus B multiplied by NOPAT. NOPAT is net operating profit after taxes in year n plus 1. This simply means the amount of monies that is available for reinvestment in the firm. And 1 minus B is the proportion of money that is not reinvested. So the proportion of money that is not reinvested is distributed to the shareholders. It's what is called the plowback, the payout ratio. 1 minus B will be the payout ratio. So the payout ratio multiplied by NOPAT corresponds to the free cash flow at time n plus 1. And then let's focus on the denominator. Okay, we leave WACC as it is, and then in the formula for G, for the nominal growth rate that we saw before, we're going to substitute WACC, ROIC for WACC, because we are assuming that the return on invested earnings is equal to WACC. When we do that, you obtain this expression here in the denominator and we elaborate a little bit the formula, we obtain this final expression, that the terminal value at time n is equal to no path at time n plus 1 divided by WACC minus pi. So this means that when no value is added, meaning when ROIC is equal to WACC, the perpetuity will grow with inflation. Let's focus in more detail this concept of added value. The fact is that no firm can add value forever, because it's impossible to find a firm that forever in eternity is able to have positive net present values projects available. Okay? Firms cease to exist at some point. This is why some analysts define the horizon, the projection period, as the period during which the firm is expected to invest at reinvestment rates exceeding 1, meaning as the period during which the firm expects to invest in positive net present value projects. After this period, then, it is assumed that the firm does not add any more value, meaning that we assume a perpetuity with no value added, and as we saw before, this implies a perpetuity growing at the inflation rate. The problem with this approach is that sometimes it is expected for the firm to add value for a very long period of time, but at the same time, we are not ready to make a detailed cash flow projection for, say, 30 or 40 years. So the way out of this dilemma is to assume one or more declining phases of growth. So we first make a cash flow projection, a detailed cash flow projection, then we assume one or more phases of growth, declining growth, until a final phase is reached when the growth rate is equal to inflation. And at this point, we introduce the perpetuity. So, summarizing, we will have then a cash flow with 3 parts. A first part will be a detailed cash flow projection. A second part, which will be composed of one or more intermediate stages of declining growth rates. And finally, the third part is an inflation growth perpetuity. Given that it is very hard to justify an inflation growth perpetuity for eternity, so usually what we prefer is to have a relatively low weight of this perpetuity in the value of the firm. So what we seek is to have a relatively low proportion of the present value of this terminal value as a proportion of the final value of the firm. And the common practice is not to have a present value of the perpetuity that exceeds 20% of the total value of the firm. We said before then that we have these two first stages. Okay, the first stage is a detailed cash flow projection, and then we have several intermediate stages. Well, once we reach the intermediate stage, we need some kind of stability, because once we reach the first intermediate stage, we have to assume a certain growth rate for this period. And the cash flows are going to grow at this growth rate. So there is certain stability, of course, consistent with the growth rate, but certain stability. So this brings us to our first conclusion here, which is this general rule that the detailed cash flow projection must last until stability can be assumed. So as long as we expect instability in the cash flow, we should keep making a very detailed cash flow projection. Once we can assume safely that there will be some stability, also probably at a relatively high growth rate, but still stability, then we introduce the intermediate growth stages. And then after we reach, the growth rates will be decreasing over time until we reach the final perpetuity at the inflation at the inflation growth rate. So what is our conclusion here? Well, we know that most firm valuations assume a terminal value perpetuity growing faster than long-term inflation. In our opinion, this is a mistake, because as we explained before, no firm can add value in perpetuity. So the terminal value must not grow faster than inflation. Of course, this assumption does not have grave consequences as long as the present value of the terminal value represents a modest proportion of the value of the firm. Unfortunately, this is not usually the case. Usually what we have is that we have, at the same time that we have a perpetuity at the end growing at a rate which is larger than inflation, at the same time we have a very high proportion of the terminal value into the present value of the firm. And we believe that this is not right. As we said before, what is recommended, that we recommend, is to incorporate intermediate growth stages, followed by then a final inflation growth perpetuity. So the final perpetuity must grow at the inflation rate. And this is everything we wanted to share with you in this opportunity.